evening and welcome everyone tuning in tonight. My name is Christina Turner and I am the Director of Education at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Tonight's event, Women of Color Lighting the Way to Equality in New Bedford and Beyond, will showcase the rich legacy of civic engagement of women of color and the ways in which they have historically organized to address inequity for women and how they continue to address issues of class, race, and other oppressions in our own community. Tonight's event is being brought to you by the New Bedford Whaling Museum, whose mission is to ignite learning through explorations of art, history, science, and culture, and the YWCA of Southeastern Massachusetts, whose mission is dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Support for this event comes from The Vote, a statewide conversation on voting rights, which is a special initiative of Mass Humanities that includes organizations around the state and is made possible by the Massachusetts Cultural Council. This event specifically falls under the umbrella of Lighting the Way, Historic Women of the South Coast, which is a collaborative public history project that utilizes multiple platforms to explore the historical impact of women from the region. Through extensive research, public outreach, and programming, Lighting the Way aims to amplify history through the narratives of remarkable women and their previously untold stories of vision, determination, and perseverance. I'm excited to share the next hour with you in conversation with Professor Premilla Nadasen and panelists Laurel Berryman, Brianna Grace, Lisa Lemire, and Maria Rosario, as we explore the ways in which women of color have historically organized and continue to organize and light the way for us all. To start off the night with a welcome, I am honored to introduce Gail Forts. Gail is a lifelong resident of New Bedford, and since 2006, she has served as the executive director of the YWCA of Southeastern Massachusetts, who is a co-sponsor of tonight's event. Gail is truly committed to the YWCA's mission of eliminating racism and empowering women. She is the 2015 Standard Times New Bedford Woman of the Year and a 2016 Unsung Heroine for the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women. Please join me in welcoming Gail Forts.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for this very special session. Very excited to have all of you with us. The YWCA, for over 150 years, has been committed to racial justice and social justice. Since the 1800s, YWCAs across the globe have worked towards these efforts. As we know, this year is such a special year, with 2020 marking the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing and protecting women's constitutional right to vote, following decades of agitation and protests by the women's suffrage movement. But as we know, it's mainly white women that had the right to vote. Women of color did not have the right to vote until 1965 and the Voters Act. At the YWCA, we work every day to make sure that we can eliminate racism and empower women in many different forms. And YWCAs were at the forefront of this movement going forward. But even today, in 2020, we know voting and having the right to vote and access to vote is still being challenged in many communities. So tonight's discussions are very important to hear our voices heard and what we can do to make sure that everyone has access and the right to vote. I want to thank all of our partners, all of our sponsors. Special thank you to the Whaling Museum, Christina, Kathy, and Jocelyn for all of your help and assistance and collaboration. It's been such great to partner with all of you. To our speakers tonight and panelists, we're very excited that you're all here with us as well. And a special thank you to the YWCA Director of Advocacy and Resource Development, Jordan Latham, who's behind the scenes right now, who this started off as an idea and many discussions over a year ago to have this. Of course, we'd hope this would be in person, but we're so excited that all of you can be here tonight. So thank you, Jordan, for your thoughtfulness, for your innovation in making this event a success. So thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's panel.
Thank you so much, Gail. Now, to set the scene for tonight, I'm excited to welcome our next speaker and project scholar for this event, Lee Blake, who will provide us with historical context for tonight's conversation. Lee is an education administrator with over 30 years experience as a teacher and administrator in urban education in New York and Massachusetts. Lee also serves as the president of the New Bedford Historical Society, where she develops and implements programs that highlight the role of African Americans, Native Americans, and Cape Verdeans in the life and history of the greater New Bedford area. Her work also includes researching and writing biographies for the Lighting the Way project. She's also one of the project's founding committee members. Lee was recently awarded the Governor's Award in Humanities, as well as the National Park Service Robert Stanton Network to Freedom Award for her work preserving the history of people of color. Please join me in welcoming Lee Blake.
So thank you, Christina. Good evening, good people. I am Lee Blake, president of the New Bedford Historical Society. I welcome you and thank you for joining the Lighting the Way team in our discussion on women of color lighting the way. I'm so excited about this program because I've been doing research for so many years. I love seeing all of us collaborating on this issue. This evening, we hope to share the rich community building work members of the local women's community are doing while highlighting the work of women around the country that are doing to make the world a better place for our families and our children. This program came about as some of us look for a way to celebrate and commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, while also shedding the role on how Black women participated in supporting voting rights and rights for all people to vote. This was a 72-year struggle from Seneca Falls to 1920, but also for Black women to 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. As president of the New Bedford Historical Society, I work with a team of volunteers that work to preserve and celebrate the heritage of African Americans, Native Americans, West Indians, and Cape Verdeans who contributed to the growth and development of the city of New Bedford. Over our 25-year existence, we're only 25, our members have raised the visibility of Black and Indigenous history by not allowing those who profess to tell the story of the city to diminish and marginalize our part in the development of this city and this country. You can see examples of our advocacy and our work about the city, from saving the Nathan and Polly Johnson House to the Douglas Memorial on City Hall lawn, the mural to the 54th Massachusetts, the statue of Lewis Temple at our public library, the memorial to Paul Cuffey that now graces the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and soon to be the Abolition Row Historic District. The Nathan and Polly Johnson House was the first home in freedom for Frederick and Anna Douglass. In telling the story of New Bedford's Abolition Row, we amplify the voices of New Bedford's women who were actively involved in the anti-slavery movement before the Civil War. It is through the experiences of women fighting to end slavery that white women began to recognize their own oppression and suppression of their rights and voices as women. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, worked with Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and other African-American sheroes to end slavery in this country. And as you all know, Frederick Douglass was a big voice and a strong supporter of women's suffrage. As they continued to organize for Black freedom, white women hoped they would be granted the right to vote as Black men were being given by the 15th Amendment in 1870. However, as we all know, that did not happen. Women did not get the vote, and that created a schism and a breakdown in the efforts of white women to support Black people and their quest for civil rights and social justice. The history got pretty ugly, with staunch allies lasting out and demanding that education white women deserve the vote, while the formerly enslaved and uneducated should not. This was the period of Reconstruction. It was a hopeful time for Black civil rights that ended sadly in voter suppression, the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan, and other forms of state-sponsored terrorism, including lynching. Segregation reigned over the country with separate but equal laws guiding everything, including education, schools, transportation, housing, just to name a few. In 1890, Black women began to organize around fighting these issues in their communities, especially around anti-lynching advocacy. Just between 1890 to 1900, 10 years, 1,217 people of color were lynched, usually men, but often men and their families. Racial terrorism was supported by the federal and local government. I do want to mention here, part of pulling together the past history is to let you know what's going on now. I do want to mention that in June of this year, Senators Pamela Harris and Cory Booker introduced an anti-lynching bill to make lynching a federal crime. For the past 100 years, it has not been a federal crime. The bill was blocked by Senator Rand Paul on the day of George Floyd's funeral. In 1890, the Southern press began their own attack on Black women as they heard about Black women organizing for the protection of their community. James Jacks, who was a president of the Missouri Press Association, began placing letters, editorials in newspapers across the country and in England, stating that most colored women in the United States were wholly devoid of morality and they were prostitutes, liars, and thieves. I often mention this attack as the echoes of Jack's action pop up in contemporary statements about welfare queens, demonstrators as thugs, and Black women as liars. We have to deal with this all the time. It seems that these racist statements never really disappear. This vicious attack on Black womanhood was answered with a call to convention by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin of Boston, who had started the first Black feminist newspaper in 1890, the Women's Era. The convention was held in Boston, and Black women from around the country came to strategize and mobilize against oppression and against the slanderous depiction of Black people and Black women especially. Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, New Bedford's own Elizabeth Carter, Hallie Q. Brown, and Nanny Burroughs all attended and became important voices in the movement to end racist violence and oppression nationally in their communities. In 1896, anti-lynching crusader and journalist Ida B. Wells and other Black women established the National Association for Colored Women. It was considered to be the first national African-American civil rights organization. It swelled to 28 federations and over 1,000 clubs and boasted membership that was 50,000 strong, all going back to organizing their own community. Black women also fought for female suffrage through clubs created within churches and founded Greek letter organizations such as the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority in 1908 and Delta Sigma Theta in 1913. The NACW helped organize masses of Black suffragettes who started voter education clubs, created and submitted petitions, and volunteered on local campaigns. It was a collective action of these colored women's clubs across the country that began to address the issues of importance to local women. There was very little support for Black women's organizations from the suffrage movement, which made a decision that Southern women were the allies necessary to get the vote. Black women continued to push to support suffrage for all Black people. The stories of Black suffragettes are coming to light due to the due diligence of our historians. New Bedford's own Martha Briggs Educational Club is a member of the NACWC and will be celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. As we commemorate the 19th Amendment, we highlight the persistence and tenacity of Black women suffragettes who fought the good fight for all citizens of the US to vote. We know that when all women won the right to vote in 1920, Black men and women were subject to voter suppression obstacles. We continued to fight for voting rights with the Civil Rights Bills of 1965. Our right to vote is once again an issue, as voter suppression tactics are again being used around the country in an effort to suppress the Black, Latino, and Native American vote. Stacey Abrams and others are forcefully addressing this issue nationally, and she has a new film out, All In. We'll have to go and see it. While I hope this gives you some of the historic background of the struggle for Black suffrage, while illustrating the split that occurred with white suffragists. The tension between white women and women of color has been a challenge throughout the years of the women's movement. We continue to work together to acknowledge our past history and look forward to collecting action that is inclusive and supportive of all women. The organizations represented here tonight illustrate these actions and goals of our moving our community forward. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to work with all of you. And now I'll return the program to Christina.
Thank you so much, Lee. I appreciate that the deep dive into history. It's been so helpful tonight. And all year, Lighting the Way has been commemorating the Women's Suffrage Centennial. But as Lee has so eloquently demonstrated, the march towards universal suffrage was a winding path. We know that even without sanctioned political power, however, that women of color have found many ways to be civically engaged. There are countless stories of women who work tirelessly to effectively make change and build communities. Joining me in conversation tonight to explore and expand upon these themes is Professor Premilla Nadasen, who is here thanks to the Organization of American Historians. Professor Nadasen joined the Barnard faculty in 2013 and is affiliated with the American Studies and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies programs. She teaches, researches, and writes about race, gender, social policy, and organizing. Her most recent book, Household Workers Unite, examines how African-American domestic workers in the United States strategically use storytelling to develop a political identity and through their organizing, reshape the landscape of labor organizing. She has won numerous awards and honors for her work. She is currently writing a biography of South African singer and activist Miriam Makeba. Professor Nadasen is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, served on the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the New York Historical Society Center for Women's History, and is co-chair of the National Women's Studies Association Annual Conference. Professor Nadasen has also bridged the academic and activist work by making scholarship accessible to people outside of the university. She has been a museum consultant, has written op-eds for newspapers and online outlets, and has served as an expert witness before the New York State Assembly Committee on Labor, as well as the Federal Department of Labor. At the moment, she is collaborating with the Institute of Policy Studies and the National Domestic Workers Alliance on We Dream in Black project to mobilize Black domestic workers in the South. If everyone could please join me in welcome Professor Premilla Nadasen tonight. Hello and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christina. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you, as well as all of the activists and panelists who will be joining us tonight. So thank you.
Absolutely. And Lee has done such an amazing job of sort of setting the scene for tonight's conversation. I'm really excited to sort of like dive in and to hear more from you and more about your work. I feel like it makes sense to sort of start where Lee left off, or where sort of the Lighting the Way project started this year, which is looking at the centennial of the 19th Amendment and really starting to think about that the legacy there. Which brings me to, I was, reading one of the op-ed that you had sent from the Washington Post, and there's a quote there that stands out that's I think connects to a lot of the themes that we've already been seeing tonight, and that's historical memory often centers on dramatic moments, although ordinary people have been the primary agents of change. And that really just stood out as sort of like capturing the theme of what we've been sort of highlighting so far. And I'm curious how in your work has you seen this hold true for the suffrage movement, and what examples do we have of that?
Well, I'll just say that as a historian, one of the things that has motivated me is this question of how does social change happen? We're often taught that social change happens from the top down, that there are powerful leaders who are the ones who enact change. So we associate certain people with progressive victories, whether it's the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the role of Martin Luther King, or women's suffrage, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are often the people that come to mind. But I think it's important to remember that without mass mobilization, without on-the-ground organizing, we would have never realized many of these very important historical milestones. And Lee gave a wonderful overview of the sort of complexity of the suffrage movement and the many, many people of different racial backgrounds, genders, who were involved in the enactment of the 19th Amendment. So people marched, they wrote treatises, and they went on hunger strikes. So the mobilization, I think, is a really critical part for thinking about the ways in which history evolves and how social change happens. It reminds me of a woman named Georgia Gilmore. This is not about suffrage, but I think it is about social change. Georgia Gilmore was a cook and a domestic worker who lived in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s. And even before the 1955 boycott, she waged her own personal struggle against the boycott, against the segregated buses because of the persistent racist treatment. And when the boycott started, she got other domestic workers together and she started selling sandwiches and chicken dinners and cakes and pies to raise money for the boycott. They raised hundreds of dollars, and they called themselves the Club from Nowhere as a way to protect the vulnerable members from losing their jobs. So she is one of those people, one of those unsung heroines whose name we don't hear about, but who was absolutely critical to the success of the movement.
I'm curious.
And the same, I think, is true. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'll let you finish your thought.
Well, I was going to say the same is true, of course, of the suffrage movement, and the ways in which there were many, many people from many walks of life whose name we don't hear, who were deeply involved in realizing suffrage as a right for women. And it was a struggle, as Lee said so eloquently, that continued on into the 20th century, the end of the 20th century.
So I guess that it brings like two questions. One is how do we find these stories of these women and these individuals, or even organizations that don't get these big platforms? But then also, if we just specifically hone in on, again, this 19th Amendment, how significant then was the 19th Amendment to women of color who may have not been granted the rights of its passage, by its passage?
Well, as Lee said, the 19th Amendment didn't fully give, especially Black women and brown women, the right to vote in this country. I think in order to understand that, we have to consider that historical moment, some of which Lee already covered, so I'm not going to go into a lot about that, but there was vicious racial violence, lynchings, and race riots. And when we say race riots in the early 20th century, what we're talking about is armed white mobs who were destroying Black homes and businesses and killing Black people with impunity. There was systemic institutionalized racism at this moment. And the movement itself, as Lee explained, was not immune from this. So, people like Stanton and Anthony, although they started in the abolitionist movement, evolved to a place of deeply held racist and xenophobic beliefs about who was qualified to vote. And later suffragists as well in the early 20th century either catered to or acquiesced to racist white Southerners. So the argument for women's suffrage that was made by many white women was really premised on white supremacy. And that's a reality that I think has defined the suffrage movement for white women. So the 19th Amendment theoretically applied to all women, but the reality was that most non-white women didn't have access to the franchise even after the passage of that amendment. So I would say that the achievement of women's suffrage was a process, not a moment. So in addition to the 19th Amendment, we can look at things like the 1965 Voting Rights Act as a critical marker. We can look at something like the 1986 Immigration Amnesty, which gave undocumented women, some undocumented women in this country, the right to vote. Or we can look at the 1924 law that granted US citizenship to Native Americans. So I think all of these are part of the process of granting women or enabling women to fully realize the right to vote in this country.
Yeah. So going back to the idea that, you know, ordinary people have been the agents of change then. And so there's these big historical markers in time, but it's, you know, and then another quote from your article where every pinnacle of progressive social change is marked by interludes of small scale efforts, people who engage in the day-to-day work of community organizing that set the foundation and create momentum for spectacular protests that capture the public imagination. And I'm curious, what are other examples of this from women, from Black and brown women throughout our history that we can see?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we understand grassroots organizing as a motivator of change, I think it forces us to shift our gaze away from the very well-known to the less well-known. It moves us away from national spokespeople to the people who are in the trenches. And there are many, many examples. And we're going to hear later this evening from some of those people in New Bedford, which I'm very excited about. But historically, for example, we could look at the welfare rights movement in the 1960s. The welfare rights movement was made up of poor African-American women, mostly African-American women. It was an interracial movement. These were mostly single mothers who demanded welfare benefits in order to raise their children. They believed that state assistance for those in need, especially single mothers, was a right. And they wanted to devote time to mothering, which they saw as valuable and necessary to raise the next generation. And their political demands were very distinct, perhaps even contradictory from those demands of most feminists in the 1960s. Most feminists in that period were seeking to enter the workplace. They wanted jobs outside the home. But for welfare recipients at this moment in time, they were actually being forced into the labor market by welfare officials. It was the first time that we saw federally mandated work requirements for welfare recipients. So what they wanted, and most of the jobs that were available for them were low-paying jobs, was back-breaking work. So for women in the welfare rights movement, feminism meant that women should have the right to choose to enter the workforce or to stay home with their children. So the welfare rights movement is one of those movements that I think is not always recognized as a part of the women's movement, but many of these women saw themselves as and embraced the term feminism. You know, I think the ways in which we understand the historical narrative and the ways in which certain people have been extremely prominent in historical narratives has to do in part by the way that historians have crafted this narrative. So who are historians uplifting and highlighting? But it also has to do, I think, with the ways in which people with power are overrepresented in the archives. So they're the ones who write the memoirs. They're the ones who keep their personal papers that are deposited in archival collections. They're the ones who are interviewed by the media. And so I think our struggle to get beyond just the most visible leaders is one that is in part about, as you said so clearly about finding these other stories, right? About documenting those other stories, about reaching out to people who we know are involved, who we know are engaged, and making them a part of our historical conversation. And that's partly why I think this event tonight is so incredibly important.
Yeah, and I'm excited for when we sort of bring in our panelists who are going to give us that context for what we are doing right now, or what people are doing now in New Bedford. And it's interesting to think about that as history that's being written, and the stories that we are documenting now being available or being accessible to sort of to give a fuller picture to like those moments that we showcase along with sort of the day-to-day. Before we get to the sort of the local perspective, I'm wondering if you have, other examples of, contemporary things similarly where we're seeing women organize around different things, and on the local level and other communities, or even sort of more broadly in sort of what we're seeing in some of our national movements as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I do a lot of work with the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative, which is based in Biloxi, but it's an organization of child care advocates and women on welfare who utilize these child care centers. And they have been waging a struggle for over 20 years now to create or to have more accessible childcare available, especially for poor women. And these are women on welfare who are mandated by federal law to work for 30 to 40 hours a week. Of course, it's very difficult for them to do that if they don't have childcare assistance. But the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative organizes throughout the state. They have been, so I think it's much more than just an advocacy organization for low income women. They're actually helping rethink the meaning of grassroots organizing through the ways in which they connect with local communities all around Mississippi. I think, as we think about sort of what constitutes or what falls under that rubric of feminism, it's really important that we think about the ways in which our dominant or our standard definitions of feminism are actually fairly circumscribed. I think we have to actually broaden how we think about feminism, and it helps us. I mean, one of the things that historians have argued, and not only historians, but is that we have to take seriously how race and class, citizenship, language, sexuality, and ability influence what it means to be a woman and how that impacts your day-to-day life. So there is no monolithic woman's experience. Academics often use the term intersectionality, and this was a term that was coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw to illuminate how gender is an unstable category and how it is shaped by other intersecting power relations. So what that means is if you're wealthy and racially privileged, your lived experience of gender is very different from someone who is an undocumented immigrant, for example. So gender cannot be disentangled or extracted from race, culture, class, etc. And because women live gender differently, how they understand feminism differs as well. And I think, where this takes us is to think about the ways in which women of color organize a whole range of issues that are very important to them as women. And I would suggest, and I would push us to think about the ways in which women's organizing around economic justice and labor organizing is also a form of feminist activism. How the struggles around the movement for Black lives and the opposition to unfair detention of immigrants is also a form of feminist activism. How the campaign for educational equity can also be considered a form of feminist activism. So I think taking an intersectional lens allows us to really think about the multiple ways and the multiple spaces in which women are advocating and pushing for empowerment for all women.
Sorry, my mute was on. I was just saying,
you're muted.
Yeah, I was just saying that it's amazing, and also amazing to sort of like draw this line that we started, right? Thinking about, we have this moment in time, this centennial of this thing that we're celebrating, and then, really going and thinking about how exactly women, and specifically women of color, were invested and involved or continued the work of organizing, not just on this sort of this large scale, but beyond that, and how that we can trace that thread through the different movements and different things that are happening even now and more sort of like present day. And how, again, that it's not a defined thing, it's this ongoing morphing, changing thing, because there's so many factors that come into play. It makes me even more excited to think about who our panelists are, and thinking about, the representation in both the labor movement and in education and in arts and culture, and all the different ways that, work that's happening in New Bedford is happening in so many different arenas, so that we can really actually see that in action and in motion. I also wanted to remind our attendees that we have a chat box. So if you have questions or things that you wanted to ask as we're going through, or things that pop into your mind, that you can just insert questions into the chat box as we go, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to answer those throughout, but also at the end when we have a second to chat with our panelists. I'm curious, Pamela, if there are other things that you think are important to highlight as we sort of focus on this theme of women of color in organizing, and just thinking about the uniqueness of the work that they do. Are there other key things that, even in your class and sort of the work that you do with your students, that you think are foundational to sort of understanding this?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think that when we think about social movements, we often want to take the people who we read about in history, who we see as the leaders, and put them up on a pedestal, right? And we sort of are sometimes waiting. We're waiting for somebody like that in this particular moment. We're waiting for somebody like that to sort of lead us or engage us. But I think one of the lessons that I draw from history is that the leaders are often within us, right? And so how can we find the strength within us? How can we find the empowerment within ourselves to engage and change? So when I think about women like Georgia Gilmore, or when I think about someone like Johnny Tillman, who was executive director of the National Welfare Rights Organization. Johnny Tillman never finished high school. And if somebody like that can one day wake up and say, I'm going to make a difference, and I'm going to be the change that I want to see, I think it's an example for all of us, right? And that we all have the power within us to contribute to social change. And I think even in those moments when there aren't big demonstrations, that daily work that we do is always contributing to something larger.
Yeah, and I actually think it's like a perfect transition to sort of just like bring in our panelists and hear a little bit about the work they do. So I'm gonna do some brief introductions and sort of expand our conversation a little bit. So we are about to welcome 4 panelists. There are, again, I said representation from different organizations throughout New Bedford, so I'm just gonna do some quick bios. I will say that for full bios on the panelists, you can visit the event page, which the link is in the chat box now. So our first panelist that we are going to welcome is Laurel Berryman. Laurel is the Racial and Gender Equity Program Coordinator at the YWCA of Southeastern Massachusetts. In this role, she specializes in developing educational programs about race and gender and fostering conversations for change. As a lifelong New Bedford resident, Laurel supports art, culture, and civil rights organizations through volunteering, membership, and providing technical assistance for virtual events. Welcome, Laurel. Our next panelist is Rayana Grace. Rayana is a lifelong New Bedford resident. In 2018, she began her role as the Arts and Culture Program Manager at the South Coast Community Foundation. In her role, Grace provides support for arts and culture nonprofit organizations that serve youth, immigrants, and culturally and ethnically diverse populations in Fall River and New Bedford through grants, technical assistance, and other programming. In 2016, she was named one of the 5 South Coast Emerging Leaders under 40. In 2017, she graduated from Leadership South Coast. In 2018, she was awarded the Spirit of Leadership Award from the YWCA of Southeastern Massachusetts. And in 2020, she was accepted as the Places Fellow through the Funders Network. Welcome, Rayana. Our next panelist is Lisa Lemire, who is the president of the Southeastern Massachusetts Central Labor Council and organizer with 1199 SEIU. Lisa has been a union organizer with SEIU since 2005, representing healthcare workers, including hospital and nursing home workers and personal care attendants, with the mission of achieving quality healthcare and good jobs for all. Lisa was elected the first Latina president of the GSMLC in 2017 and has been a delegate for over 18 years. Lisa is also the Massachusetts Democratic Party elected senatorial woman and state committee member and co-chair of the New Bedford Democratic City Committee. And last but certainly not least, our final panelist tonight is Maria Rosario. Maria has served over 16 years as the executive director of North Star Learning Centers, a minority-led nonprofit organization that serves disadvantaged New Bedford area children, youth, and families. A citizen leader who leads cultural awareness, she's been instrumental in building bridges between schools, families, and communities. In 2006, she won the New England Grantee of the Year from the New England Minority Business Development Agency. She was a 2016 YWCA Women of Distinction awardee, and most recently was recognized by the Providence, Rhode Island-based Latino Public Radio for her exceptional leadership and dedication to community in its multiple dimensions. Welcome, Maria. And welcome to all of our panelists. We are so excited to have you here tonight because as we talk about the work of the legacy of both the 19th Amendment, but also of organizing and women's work and what is happening in our communities on the ground and the work that happens that may not always get the large platforms and be amplified. We are super excited to hear from you and hear your work and hopefully do the process of writing that history and amplifying the work that is happening in New Bedford and has been happening in New Bedford. So again, welcome, and we're super excited to hear from you all.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Thank you.
So this is, you know, like as much as we say it's like, let's make it a conversation, I hope that we can make it as a conversation as much as possible. I would love to hear, and I'm sure Professor Nadasen would also love to hear, you know, and I'm going to give a bit of a quote from our article. Your article had so many good quotes. It says, feminist organizing has real world impact, from advocating for workplace equity to expand in childcare assistance to learning how to embrace gender non-conforming young people. Most of these successes have resulted, however, not from high profile marches, but from grassroots day-to-day organizing. And I think that speaks very truly and accurately to, I think, the work that a lot of you are doing. And so I'm so curious the work is you're doing, what's happening in your organizations, and how that work do you feel is connected to, run by, supported by women and women of color in New Bedford? Or you can also add to any of this, sort of the things that we've already talked about. Like, so however you want to tackle this.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
And it was funny in thinking of how to start my job, of course, and then thinking of how I volunteer, I've noticed that I'm drawn to organizations that support women and girls, being on the board of our sister school, being on the board of the Historical Society, which Lee spoke about, serving people of color in New Bedford and uplifting the stories, and in my professional role at the Community Foundation. So I figured I would start there, where I spend most of my time. So in my role as Arts and Culture Program Manager, as Christina mentioned, work with organizations that serve youth and immigrants and culturally and ethnically diverse communities in Fall River and New Bedford. And coming into this funder position, especially having a nonprofit background, I was already aware of the gaps in funding that go to organizations led by people of color, but now being a funder and seeing the statistical data and how little dollars is awarded to organizations that are led by or that serve people of color, specifically Black and Latinx communities, there's a stark contrast. And seeing the cultural groups here whose budgets may be small, but their passion far exceeds the organizations that are the more mainstream organizations that might get the attention and the dollars. We've really been intentional about where our funding is going and setting that example for other funders that we work with locally and regionally and across the state. And I think that there's so often something that comes to mind often in this work is the power dynamic between funder and grantee. It's like you're asking for money, so you have to appease to whatever the funder is asking for. And I feel like in my role and with my fellow staff, we've really tried to build that trust and break that power dynamic. And I think especially as a Black woman, I'm very cognizant of power dynamics, and both professionally and personally, I can see how that comes into play in a lot of different atmospheres. And so in my role at the Community Foundation, I always try to quell that power dynamic and to really get on the same level as our grantees. And it's always so great to hear from grantees that they think that we're building trust, that we're being more transparent, and that we're being responsive and putting community first, because what's a community foundation that isn't putting community first? And it's interesting because there's data that shows that organizations that are tied to an identity, so like race or ethnicity or gender or ability, are actually more resilient than organizations that don't have that type of tie. And so as a funder, seeing that right here in the South Coast, it's no different, that the organizations that tend to be the cultural organizations, the grassroots organizations that have a strong mission, that are tied to an identity or a specific purpose, they have that community around them that helps them to bounce back, especially in a time like this during the pandemic. So it's really interesting to see how kind of my own anecdotal experience is now aligning with the data that's out there. And again, seeing the work of the South Coast nonprofits, it's amazing to see how many are led by women and women of color. And those tend to be our biggest thought partners as a funder to see what's going on the ground. Many of the women on this call are who we look to get a perspective that's needed in our role.
Thank you, Rihanna. Is there anybody else wants to jump in on any of those pieces that you mentioned, or?
I'm happy to jump in. Lisa Lemieux, president of the Greater Southeastern Massachusetts Labor Council. I mean, I'm just excited beyond words that we're having this discussion, that people like me are being included in this discussion. It's not, new that women have been excluded, not only just from the labor movement, but even within the labor movement. Right, I felt like I had to work my way up. I had to be recognized. I'm a girl from the south of Texas who didn't know what the word union was when I moved to Massachusetts over 30 years ago. And to be part of the labor movement, to see how it's evolved, has been an amazing part of my life, and something that I've been excited to be a part of, and excited to be a part of the change that is happening in the labor movement, the long overdue change that has been needed in the labor movement. And I could go on, all night about what has happened in the labor movement, and then what is happening currently in the labor movement, whether it's nationally or here locally. There's just so many great things that are happening to include women and women of color. And I'm just, again, happy that the Whaling Museum, has included that history and wanted to include how we move forward and how we do things differently. Lighting the Way is a wonderful program that has highlighted many women who've done great things in the city of New Bedford, including labor history. Some of those women, and I know that a lot of people who are watching know about Lighting the Way, but Dora Bastrich, right, a huge union leader, Clementina Pont, Margaret, they were all part of the labor movement long before I was here. And then we can move forward. And, my predecessor, the president of the Greater Southeastern Massachusetts Labor Council, she was the first female president of the Labor Council and was there for almost 30 years before I got elected in 2017. And I'm proud to be able to continue the tradition of having the only female president in the state of Massachusetts of any of our labor councils. But the work that our labor movement is doing locally today, bar none, is just unbelievable. The amount of women that we have in the movement organizing on the ground, whether it's social justice, economic justice, again, I represent personal care attendants. We have over 55,000 personal care attendants in Massachusetts. These are primarily women of color, who, low-wage workers, and them organizing since 2006 has been the largest growing industry and the fastest changing industry. And we're proud of the work that we've done to take them from $10 an hour to now over $15 an hour. We fought to help, together fought to make, have them included as essential workers in this pandemic. The idea that they were even included as essential workers who were able to continue to work and get paid in the middle of this pandemic was an unbelievable achievement. And we couldn't have done it without all the partners that we have, whether it's in our communities, in our elected officials with our governor and all the way up into Congress, has made that happen. So again, I can go on forever about the work that we're doing. I wanted to make sure that we highlight our Building Pathways program. I'm super proud of the building trades and the labor movement. They do an unbelievable job educating people of our community, including people of color, but now have made it a mission to include women and women of color, and making sure that we're getting them into the building trades so they too can be part of having a good union job with dignity and respect and living wages. And women are just as good as any other man in this world, and some of them are better, right? They can be plumbers and electricians, and they can do the work. And we're proud that we have women who are joining those ranks and taking on those jobs, and they're working on our bridges and our roads, building our skyscrapers. They're doing all the work, and we're super proud of that.
Thank you. I'm curious. So one of the things that I think has also been a theme that I've heard Professor Nadasen say, and then some of the things that Lee was talking about, is the collaborative efforts. And I'm curious if your work in the different ways and the different sort of organizations that you've been working in have brought you together on projects or different things, and what are some of the ways that maybe your work has overlapped or aligned in New Bedford over the years?
Well, typically, we have male union leaders who run our unions, and they don't typically think about issues of daycare or transportation. So when, our female doctors and nurses who have to be in the hospital before 6 a.m. in the morning, they have daycare issues just like the male doctors, except that usually the wives stay at home, right, and take care of the children while the male doctors go to work. But who's going to do that for the women? And so having women in leadership in our unions has helped change that. Helping to elect female elected leaders who know these issues has helped change the way that these things are happening. And part of the way that we've started these discussions is by doing more of that collaboration with folks like, Gail and Jordan and the YW. I mean, 10 years ago, we weren't sitting at the same table having these discussions, working on these issues. Minimum wage, paid sick time, all these things would not have happened without all of us collaborating. One of our local partners that isn't here today, and I think it's important to mention them because they're having their own event tonight, is the Coalition for Social Justice. They're one of our main partners here in Southeastern Massachusetts, and we've all worked collectively together to make improvements on these issues. And so, we've started a women's alliance with the Women's Fund. And a lot of the women who are here today sit on that Women's Alliance so that we can work together to figure out what are the issues, what are women doing, what do women in our cities and towns need, and what are the industries that, how are they changing, and how do we bring women along through this change. Some jobs are going to change. Some jobs are going to go away, and they need to go away, and new jobs are going to replace them. And how do we prepare members of our community, female or not, to take on these new jobs? And having all these organizations and all these great women working together allows us to have that discussion and help lead in that change.
And if I can just quickly add, at North Star Learning Centers, we partner up with the YWCA on the issue of early education and care. Why? Because it helps to elevate the need for early education and care. It also helps us expand accessibility, and together we're much more powerful doing that. At North Star, we are a minority business enterprise, and we are a people of color-led organization where most of the administrative team happen to be women and women of color. 83% of our workforce are women, and so we are about girl power. right? Because we understand that we need to create the space, we need to create the opportunities for women of color to come at the forefront and be the leaders that they are and that we are, right? And so we have a commitment to creating those kinds of opportunities at North Star and partnering up with our local organizations is the way that we do it, particularly organizations that are led by people of color, because there is something to be said when we come together and sit at the table, because we represent and look like the communities that we serve. And there is a very specific lens when you're talking about the communities that you serve and you look like that community.
Nice. So I have a question in our chat box that asked, curious to hear the panelists finish the sentence, quote, "A more perfect union looks like," and I don't know if that means a more perfect union amongst organizations, amongst women. I think you can, interpret that how you want. How might you finish that statement?
I would say that a more perfect union is one where we have quality healthcare and good jobs for all, one where there's living wages and dignity and respect for all, and that includes eliminating racism. And that is the one thing that I am very proud about the labor movement, that we've taken a stand and acknowledged the racism that was within our unions from the very, very beginning, and said that we need to not only acknowledge it, but we need to figure out how we're going to change that. How are we going to break down the racism within our unions? And that's not an easy conversation, and it's not an easy change, but it's one that we are committed to making. And it doesn't mean that everybody agrees, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, but it's something that we're committed to. And the only way that we're going to have, an America for all is one that includes everybody. And that means that we have to eliminate racism. And that's how I see, a better union.
I agree with Lisa. I was going to say, I think it would end with equality for all, equity for all, maybe beginning with Black women, right? There hasn't been a movement that we haven't been at the forefront of. There hasn't been a president or an election that we haven't, taken the reins of. And so to be Black and to be women, as we spoke about earlier, are two very important intersections that are often misunderstood. And to have more Black women in leadership, maybe at the head of that, at the head of that race, leading America into a better place where everybody is welcome and accepted, not just rich people, not just white people, not just male people or heterosexual people, would be ideal.
I have a question directed at Professor Nadasen, asking you if you could comment on the Wall of Moms and what it says about motherhood, feminism, and race in America.
Yeah, well, I think that the politics of motherhood has often been used as a political platform for women historically, right? Whether it's demanding lower food prices or demanding an end to nuclear war, or, in this case, in opposition to state-based racial violence. And so I think it's effective to a certain degree, but I do think that the politics of motherhood can sometimes, sometimes for certain people comes from a privileged position, right? Not everybody not everybody is a mother, and not everybody can be a mother. So how can we think about the ways in which a politics of motherhood can really challenge and push us beyond the boundaries of the norms of motherhood? And I'm thinking about people who are not biological parents, for example. But how can the politics of motherhood lead to a transformation of immigration detention policies where families are being split up? So I think we need to think about motherhood as a politics that not just reinforces the nuclear family, but politics as a platform that actually leads to social transformation, which are, I think, two different ways that motherhood can be used. I think in terms of the wall of moms, it really is about state-based violence. So, you know, I'm happy about the direction that that's moving in.
Nice. Another question says, and this is for anybody who wants to tackle it, how do you think Black women leaders define good leadership? And is it different from the existing definitions of what we've been told it means to be a good leader?
I would say, and I've been having conversations about this a lot actually, and talking about what does decolonized leadership look like, and what are we doing to be the opposite of colonized leadership. And what I've been thinking about is colonized leadership, which is bad leadership, looks very much at the self, at the individual, and at being at the top, where I feel many Black women view leadership as more collaborative effort and coming from the bottom to the top, looking to other members for input to be able to move forward, rather than thinking that the person in charge always knows the answers. Another thing that I think of when I think of good leadership is really to have that humility to step back and understand other perspectives and being able to admit when you're wrong. I feel like oftentimes what can get a leader to be in a bad position is an ego that gets in their way, really taking things personally when it really isn't something that has to do with them. It's about the system. And so for leadership, for me, for good leadership, I definitely think of it as a holistic view and something that is separated from the leader. The leader is only as good as their team. And oftentimes good leaders kind of separate themselves from the team, or again, looking from the top down. I really would think for my definition of leadership, it's definitely grassroots, bottom up, and that the leadership would speak for themselves because of what's going on around them.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Anybody
I just want to second what Brianna just said. Absolutely. I think good leadership is at its core collaborative leadership. It's about people working together, you know, and it makes me think about the Combahee River Collective, which was a group of radical Black women in the 1970s that actually got its start in Boston. And that was they are the ones who actually coined the concept of intersectionality, the idea that gender is not or cannot be understood alone, but has to be taken into account, or that in conjunction with race and class, etc. The Combahee River Collective took a position, an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-imperialist, anti-heterosexist position. And I think it's an important example because it suggests to us that these radical Black women were pushing for a more just world, not just for themselves, but for everybody. Because once you begin to eradicate those forms of oppression, what you're talking about is a more just world for everyone.
Thank you. That's an amazing thing. Like, so the work that's happening and the work that you're doing, you know, is creating a more just society for everyone, a more just New Bedford for everyone, and more broadly than that as well. I'm curious, and this was a question I think that came up sort of like in our thinking about this as we were coming together. And, you know, what do you think, or what do you hope will be the impact of your work as we look back, or maybe, you know, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, like, you know, what do you hope sort of as the legacy of your work? Just like we're looking back on the 19th Amendment and thinking about the legacy of voting rights. What do you think about, you know, the work that's happening on the ground in New Bedford now and its legacy, or what you hope the legacy will be? And if that's kind of a hard question, but
yeah, it's a lot of things. But one thing that I often try to uplift is that we have really great leadership here that just is untapped and often overlooked because of the skill set that they have is viewed, again, from that colonized mind. So one of my wishes is that the bossy girls in the classroom are seen as leaders, and that the cocky girls are acknowledged for their passion, right? And that, like, anyone who's seen as like abrasive or needs to step back is really looked at as a mover and shaker who speaks their mind and stands up for what's right, and they're on the right side of history. And I think that I get questions a lot about who like can join this board or like who can lead. And there's so many people in our community that have these leadership skills, but because they're not viewed in a certain context, they're not considered for certain positions, but they have those skill sets. They have that grit, they have that tenacity, and above all, they have the passion and the mindset from the community that would help be reflective. They've gone through some certain things that helps them speak to the community members. And especially with women running for office and with the work that we were doing with the Women's Fund, I remember Dr. Jenkins said that it takes on average a woman to be asked 7 times to run for office. And so consider this one of your asks. You might be on number 3. Maybe this was your 7th. I hope that this pushed you over to the last one. But overall, women leaders are proven to be more collaborative and to be collective thinkers. And we need leaders with compassion, with motivation, with skills that come from grassroots. And so I guess the legacy that I want to leave, especially in working now with the YW on civic engagement and board leadership, definitely to get those people who might be overlooked to be able to have the confidence and to have that to get that attention that they deserve. Because again, we have such great leaders here in our community. And I would hope that they can be awakened and given the props that they deserve.
And I think as a woman of color who is a leader, I have a responsibility to open up the doors for my people too, right? And so my hope is that we, empower young women, that we empower women to take on leadership positions and support them in that process. And so that's a commitment that, I often talk about with my colleagues. What are we doing to prepare this next generation, right? So that they continue that legacy. And that's something that needs to be at the forefront of this work too.
I agree with Maria. It's very important. And, I grew up in New Bedford, and oftentimes I found myself being the only Black girl in the room, whether it was working at school. And it took a while for me to understand that I could be a leader. When in college, I majored in women's and gender studies, and that's where I started to learn about what we talk about, Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality and so on and so forth, Sojourner Truth and Ain't I a Woman and all of those things, where I started to learn that it's not me that was the problem, right? It's my race and my gender. It's these social concepts that America's created that put me at the lowest of the low on the list, if you want to call it that. And so, as the Racial and Gender Equity Program Coordinator at the YWCA Southeastern Mass, I would hope that the legacy that I leave is to, being someone who didn't always believe that she could because of who I was, and getting that education that's what I can do for the next little Black girl who, has these dreams and has these goals and has a strong, team around them of Black women like I did growing up, but still doesn't see herself represented. And it's difficult to understand that you can. And so hopefully through education, I can really implement that in the city, and that seed will grow into something.
Building off of that, and I think building off of a concept that we play with a little bit as we're figuring out how things to come together. How does one begin to bring together, community members in this work, and especially now in this moment when, post-pandemic technology is sort of like key. So how do we begin how does one begin to bring people together, but especially now where together may not mean physically together?
Well, I can tell you that the pandemic has not stopped our organizing. If anything, it has made it stronger. Our union meetings have never been more attended than they are now. I don't think that we'll ever not have virtual meetings again. We have more and more members participating in higher numbers than they have in years. So I think that will continue. as I sit and I listen to all of this, it makes me think of people like Mother Jones and Dolores Huerta and Frances Perkins, the women who were trailblazers, who did this work and were not recognized at the time that they were doing it for the work that they're doing it. And that's no different than some of us might feel that happens today. And I am confident that, women like us here today are not going to quit doing that work. And that's what's important, is that we don't stop doing the work, is that we continue to organize, and that we continue to ask more and more women to participate in organizing in whatever way that looks like or feels like for you, in whatever way it impacts your life or your community or your circle or your family, because it all joins back together again. The key is not to stop doing the work. And I struggled myself with that question for a very long time, because I never feel like I'm doing enough. I never feel like I'm doing a good enough job. And I decided many years ago that I could either run for office and try to make that change, or I can continue to be a union organizer and try to make that change on the ground. And that was ultimately where I fell. I fell on the side of continuing to be a union organizer, because I felt I could make a bigger difference. I could have a bigger impact by organizing. And it doesn't necessarily mean union organizing. And that's what's great about all us working together, is that we can work on lots of issues together, where we can bring in experts. I don't need to know everything about childcare. I don't need to know everything about transportation. But if we work together, we can support each other and we can do a better job together. And the accomplishments that we've made in Massachusetts, like passing the increase to minimum wage and paid family medical leave, are perfect examples of the accomplishments we can make when we do work together.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there are different strategies for reaching young adults. So thinking about sort of like the next generation, what are some of the strategies that you and your work, whether it be in arts and culture, or at the YWCA or at North Star Learning, how are young people being brought in?
I think that really highlighting that everyone's talents can be utilized towards our end goal, kind of building off what Lisa said. Some people aren't meant for marching, and some people are the ones we need at the forefront. Some people, we need their art. Think of any movement that's happened, and think of the amazing posters and signs that come along with it. Those are artists that are coming up with the chants and the songs and the signs that we carry. And so we need art, we need creativity. We need people to drive. Think of the caravans that we've had going on, especially with the pandemic, or to drop off supplies, or to make calls, or to write to our senators and representatives. And so I think that in bringing in youth, it's important to highlight that there's not one right way to make a change. You have that talent, and to move forward with what speaks to you, because everything can add up in a big way, especially when bringing in the youth. And I've seen it so much in arts and culture, and speaking to some organizations, the students there talking about how art has really changed their life, and how they couldn't see getting by without it. And again, how that translates into political dialogue, or into standing up for something that they believe in. It's really been great to see, and specifically, and I'm sure Laurel can speak more to this as well, the Black Lives Matter movement here in New Bedford, it was really sparked by young adults who were on the corners every day, who were at intersections, who were doing community events, and being safe and spacing out, and finding creative ways to gather and to make their voices heard. And it's been so phenomenal to see that. And I think, again, in most movements, you'll find young people who are at the helm, and maybe just didn't get that recognition. But if you think of leaders throughout history and you hear their ages, it's like, wow, they're only 21, they're only 18, making these changes. And to be able to see that here locally in New Bedford has been phenomenal and really awe-inspiring.
Hi, and I think that for us at North Star, if we say that we want youth voice, right? And that we want to create spaces where young people can come together and utilize their voice, then you have to create those opportunities for them to do that. And so at North Star, we do that in several ways. And one of the ways that we do that is when we're creating programs, we have young people be part of that, right? And so we ask them, what is it that you need? Rather than us telling them what it is that they need, young people know what they need. And if you create the opportunity for them to help shape your service delivery, then you know what you're providing is exactly what the community needs. And it's not something that's coming from you thinking that you are the savior and that you are the one who creates the services because you feel that's what they need. No, young people need to be at the table. They need to be able to tell you this works, this didn't work. And for us, some of the staff that we have were in our youth programs. And how beautiful is that to see them evolve into these great leaders that they are today. And so you nurture that. You nurture that seed. And one of the ways that we do that is that we give them an active seat at the table. I think that's important, especially if you are a service delivery provider.
Thank you so much. So we are getting to the point in our evening where we have to wind down. I wonder if there's any sort of last information or message, or just even just sort of thoughts on this experience that you want to leave our attendees with. I will just start by saying, I hope this is just the beginning, right? So we talk about the work that keeps going and amplifying those stories. And I hope that through the museum's work, my work as, you know, the director of education, but also the work through Lighting the Way, that we can continue to find ways to come together and amplify the work and support the work that we're each doing. Because, you know, as we talked about collective leadership, I hope that we are part of that together and that we can continue to work together to meet whatever individual, group, personal, community-wide goals that we each have. And so before we leave, any sort of like last thoughts or notes or messages that you want to give, now's the time.
I think that we would be remiss if we didn't mention two things that we didn't talk about tonight that are very important to our community. And that is our census and our elections.
Yes, those are going to be my last two things. So perfect. Go.
So, I mean, you know, and maybe you can say it better than I, Christina, but I don't know how, you know, how not to express how important it is that every single person is counted in our community. Our last census was not well counted. We're going down that road again for many, many, many different reasons. And there's been a lot of resources put into our community to help make sure that we count every single person in our community, to make sure that our community gets the funding that it deserves to be able to provide the services to the people who need them. And then, you know, obviously voting. We just do not have, we have voters who are not voting, and we have our community members who are not registering to vote. And we got to do everything we can to encourage every single person who's, you know, legally of the age to vote to register and vote.
Perfect. Any other last words?
I really want the mindset to shift that racial equity work should be the norm and not an exception. And that people not doing it should be weird and not people doing it. It shouldn't be an anomaly. We shouldn't have to ask, are you doing racial equity work? That should be the norm. We should make people who aren't doing racial equity work feel uncomfortable. We should be challenging them and make them feel out of place because they're not focusing on something that's so important and elevating the needs of the people around them. And I feel like so often it's like, well, racial equity work is so challenging, it's cumbersome, it's burdensome, and it's really not. It makes people uncomfortable, maybe some people, but and at the end of the day, it's liberation. It's bringing us to a place of togetherness and equity and equality and love. And so racial equity work shouldn't be seen as something that's a chore or something that's thought of separately or that's not integrated into all of our work. It shouldn't be something that it's put on a pedestal because someone's doing it. It should be put down that someone isn't doing it. This is how our lives should be. It should be integrated in everything that we do because racism infiltrates everything around us, from healthcare to education to our workforce to anything that you can think of. Racism permeates. And so we really need to step up and get the messaging across that this work is imperative and that there are so many policies that have gone on and that simply exist because no one's questioned them and no one's challenged them. And we're stepping up and we're challenging them and we're demanding answers for why things are the way that they are. And so I'd love for people to have this lens that this is work that is instrumental. It's not an option. It needs to get done, and we need everyone to step in to help make it happen. Thank you.
And I totally agree with everything you just said, Rihanna. It needs to be embedded in the work. And so thank you for speaking about this, because this is the time where that needs to be at the forefront of the work, you know, especially with what we're dealing with right now in our communities, you know. And so thank you for that. It has to be embedded in the work. It has to be.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You know, I think, you know, you said, Rihanna, it's not optional, right? It's not optional. We are at a really critical historical moment. We are at a turning point, and we have seen the rampant, unchecked police violence. We have seen the pandemic and the health crisis in our communities. We have seen the ways in which the state is wielding power to silence people. And so I think this is a moment when I really appreciate all the work that all of you are doing. It's a moment when we cannot remain silent, when we have to speak out, we have to do what we can to put forth an alternative. And the work around education and redefining the labor movement and arts and culture are part of the building blocks, right? The part of the building blocks that are going to lead to that long-term social transformation, where there is that more perfect union of economic justice and equity and, you know, an anti-racist society. But it's a process.
I just want to say thank you once again to all of our panelists. We really appreciate you spending the time talking about your work and all the work that you do that continues to go unsung. A special thank you to Dr. Premilla Nadasen for being here. We know that we had planned this sort of like in person. We had like this whole vision of sitting on a couch with coffee mugs, but we're so glad that we could do this in this format, and we hope to be able to invite you to New Bedford to see the work that's happening when it's safe to do so. As Lisa has so eloquently already done, just to remind you that, you know, it's both to be in action, not just that we are, you know, talking about the work, but that we're also sort of a call to action to do the work. And so, as she so eloquently mentioned, the U.S. Census is upcoming. September 30th is the deadline. There's a lot of work to be done, so please make sure that if you have not completed your U.S. Census, or if someone in your family hasn't, to share this information. Also, if you are looking for information on how to vote, where to vote, anything, how to register, there's also vote.org for more information on voting. I want to again thank our program sponsors and collaborators, especially the YWCA of Southeastern Massachusetts and Jordan Latham, and all the work that you have done in collaboration to help us put this together. Mass Humanities, Mass Cultural Council for the vote, and the support of this, as well as the Organization of American Historians. Thank you for connecting us with Professor Premilla Nadasen. Tremendous, and like I said, we hope that we can invite you down to New Bedford at some time in the near future. I know that there are a bunch of questions that we didn't get to tonight, but just a reminder that this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end, and we're excited to continue this work and the conversations together as we move into the future. So thank you again to everyone who was able to attend. I'm so excited to learn more and work more and collaborate with you in the future. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely night.